Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on, and today we're going to be taking a look at Valentina, not the spicy and delicious hot sauce, but the indie game for the Nintendo Switch. And since this game just dropped on the Switch's eShop a couple of days ago, I'm pretty sure almost nobody's heard of it yet. But if you have done some investigation on your own, then you're already aware that this is a 40-level long adventure platformer. And I have to be honest, platforming adventure games are one of my favorite genre because they have a mission and a premise, and bad guys and a building story, as well as the basic fundamentals of platforming. But as the story for Valentina is pretty veiled in mystery as far as the eShop description is concerned, when you actually get into the game and start playing through it, it does begin to unfold. More or less, some terrible evil has arisen in Valentina's land, and 4 dark generals have come to pretty much wreak the apocalypse. And upon bending one of the first elemental forces, the force of fire, to your will, people start to realize you are the child of prophecy, the little girl that's gonna bring about the end of the devastation. But thankfully, the actual gameplay isn't nearly as perilous as the game's story. As an adventure platformer, we do get the background, and there are some additional elements thrown in, but for the most fundamental portion, it's a fairly simple and straightforward platformer. Each of the 40 handcrafted levels are divided up into 4 different worlds, and each of these worlds have their own semi-elemental theme. And of course, it's in each of these elementally themed worlds that you'll find one of each of the 4 elements to take on the game's final boss. Though, as you may have expected already, you will be taking on one of the 4 Dark Generals after capturing each of the 4 elements. The boss fights aren't the only element of combat in the game, though. As you play through each of the game's levels through the 4 worlds, you will encounter non-randomized mobs, and defeating each of these will either reward you with gold coins, potions, or elemental arrows. And as your only weapon in this adventure platformer is actually your bow, it's these arrows that are going to be crucial to your success. However, depending on what type of enemy you might be facing and what elemental aspect they might have, some of these arrows may actually provide significantly more damage than other ones at your disposal. But one of the other gaming aspects that we really need to talk about that might seem a little bit more straightforward is the game's relationship between its gold and its potion system. Potions, as you can obviously expect, go toward refilling your health, but instead of refilling your entire health bar, they give you about 1.5 points of health back each. And as this really isn't that much of a benefit, thankfully you can carry up to 25 potions before maxing out your potion bag. There are no shops in the game, but if you do have more than about 100 gold and you have less than your maximum amount of potions, they will be automatically purchased to top off your potions bag back at 25. And unfortunately, this is not the same for arrows. They are a limited resource, also randomly dropped, but other than killing enemies or finding chests, there's really no way to get any more. But with that final note out of the way, it's time to move on to the graphics. It is pretty easy to tell at a glance that this game is part of the indie retro revival. With pixelated sprites, sparse environments, and floaty jump mechanics, it's really hard not to feel just a little bit nostalgic when you're playing the game. But oddly enough, the music doesn't really fit that environment. The sound effects themselves are fairly limited and very reminiscent of the limited cartridge size for older retro games. But the actual soundtrack for the game is vivid and orchestral, and actually does kind of contrast the sound effects and the visual aesthetic for the game. So if you are a huge audio fan and a fan of audio-visual continuity, that might be a negative. Other than that though, moving on to the game's critiques, there are a few things that you might want to know before diving into Valentina. First and foremost is possibly the game's length. Even with 40 levels and a handful of boss fights, it probably won't take more than about 3 hours to beat. But as the game is only about $1 and it's currently on sale for 50% off, a 50-cent game for 3 hours of entertainment is definitely, as far as duration to price ratio, pretty solid. But one thing that will stand out to gamers as a definite critique is the difficulty level and a bit of the repetition in the game. There are 40 levels across 4 worlds, but a lot of the individual levels across those 4 worlds seem to be more of just kind of a reskin of some areas in the previous world. And in that sense, the game does start to feel pretty repetitious around your 3rd iteration of the same platforming and the same navigation of moving platforms. Additionally, besides 1 or 2 new characters introduced in each of the new themed world segments, many of the game's basic enemies are also just reskins. But while that is completely forgivable, the thing about the difficulty curve is that you can play everything but the boss fights without firing a single shot off your bow. If you see an enemy, you can just quickly jump over it, and even if you were going to get hit, jumping neutralizes damage. And so if you have some pretty quick reflexes as a platforming gamer, then you actually might be able to speedrun Valentina pretty quickly. Which, looking back at it, might actually be a bonus to some platforming gamers who actually are fans of speedrunning. But where any adventure gamer might actually raise an eyebrow is in the boss fights. These are, in a sense, the boss fights in the game. They are just kind of... they kind of don't exist. You can throw yourself into combat and make yourself get hurt, or you can just stand off to the side of the screen and just spam with whatever arrows you have available. And for the second boss fight in the game, I actually wanted to see what it looked like. I wanted to try and see its attack patterns. But even then, even kind of throwing myself into it, I didn't even take a single point of damage. So long story short, the boss fights, if that's something that you do enjoy, are going to be a massive disappointment. And the final note of critique for the game that kind of drives everything home and ties it all together is actually the limited supply of limited drop arrows. Your arrows are randomly dropped in random numbers between about 2 and 4, and if you actually do want to try and slay all the mobs and progress forward at a reasonable pace, you will run out of arrows. And this will, as you may have already guessed, force you to just play the game like a speedrunner, jumping over enemies and just trying to make it to the end without any combat. And so eventually through my playthrough, I learned that unless enemies were going to prevent my timing from being accurate, I would just jump over them. And because every boss fight is preceded by an area full of arrows for you to use, there's not even any need to conserve them, which further emphasizes the fact that you're not really even supposed to be engaging in combat in the levels, only in the boss fights. But taking a step back and looking at Valentina as a whole, in relation to its price, its duration, its pros, its cons, its flaws, it's definitely an entertaining game that's worth its price, because its price right now is 50 cents. But it may be best suited for a gamer who's not typically super great at platformers or super great at adventure or boss-style combat. For someone who's breaking into these genres, it may be perfect. But for anyone who's expecting it to be another Ghoul Boy, it is definitely not at that level, and if that's your expectation, even for 50 cents, you'll probably be disappointed. But that does about bring us to the end of the review of Valentina for the Nintendo Switch, so if you enjoyed the review, or especially if you found it helpful, feel free to throw us a like or a comment to show your support, and don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with future content. There are new and unique indie games coming out literally every single day, and we put out several reviews a week, so there's always going to be something new to find. But as we are still a small channel, if you did enjoy the review, if it was helpful, please smash that like button and help us grow. I know most people think we have a big studio working here, but in all honesty, it's just me, and I use we because it's a bit more inclusive. But anyway, this has been The Budget Gamer, so as always, thanks for watching.